Okay, welcome to NUPI, everyone. It's very good to see you here. My name is Kjetil Selvik. I'm a researcher here at NUPI, and together with Jakob Høgel from the University of Oslo, we will present our new book on media and journalism in politics in Lebanon and Tunisia. And we will speak mainly about Tunisia today, because Tunisia is going through a very turbulent time with a dismantling of a democracy that was very promising and inspired a lot of hope after the Arab uprisings, but is in dire straits today. And then we are very happy to have Emeritus Professor Katrien Foltmer here from University of Leeds, who is a renowned scholar and expert of the media's role in transitioning democracies. And we must say has inspired our work a lot. So we're very excited to have her comments on the book and to engage in a conversation with her after a presentation where we lay out some of the arguments we make in the book and tie that to current developments in Tunisia. So this is both an opportunity to discuss Tunisia and an opportunity to discuss our book. So I'll give the floor first to Jacob, and we'll go a bit back and forth.
Thank you. So, in 2011, Tunisians cast aside many decades of harsh authoritarian rule, and they embarked on a process of democratization. Let's see if I can get this to do something for me. Yes. They soon achieved impressive results. In October 2011, they held free and fair parliamentary elections. In 2014, the parliament passed a new democratic constitution, and later that same year, after having passed a new constitution, there were parliamentary elections and presidential elections held, and power was peacefully transferred. In 2015, a quartet of civil society organizations even received the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to achieve a national compromise between the polarized political camps, and thus helping democratization. And in 2018 and in 2019, the Economist's Democracy Index counted Tunisia, together with Israel, as the only two democracies in the Middle East and North Africa, albeit flawed democracies, but the only two democracies in the Middle East and North Africa. With regard to media, state media, formerly harshly controlled, heavily controlled state media, was made into public media, giving them editorial freedom, much like the BBC and Norwegian NRK. Private news and entertainment media flourished, as you can see here, just by the numbers, right? When we started interviewing journalists in 2016, that's when we had our first research trip to Tunisia, people would continually say that the most important achievement of the revolution, and a massive achievement at that, was freedom of expression. And there was no going back from freedom of expression. Now, all was not well. The economy grew worse over the years, and ordinary people faced tougher living conditions. And a big problem was that politicians seemed unable to address these economic issues because they were mired in conflicts. There was and is a very serious divide between Islamist and secular political forces, and a deep mistrust. And in addition, there were lots of petty personal squabbles among politicians. And some parliamentarians even called for a return to the Ben Ali autocracy. So to some extent, at various periods, there was political chaos and there was political paralysis. The new institutions and the new constitution that was achieved in 2014 were just one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin was the game that went on behind the democratic scenes, where politics and power deals were being worked out secretly, far from the public eye. So all this made many Tunisians feel steadily more alienated from politics. And in regard to the media, there was widespread media capture or media instrumentalization. What we mean by media instrumentalization is that businessmen and resource-rich politicians controlled the editorial content either directly or indirectly through funding. So directly, you had, for example, the various parties in government trying to control, trying to influence the editorial line of the public media by putting pressure on them. Then in the private sector, you have Nabil Karoui, who you see the picture of there, who was very involved in politics. He ran for president in 2019, and he owned the Nesma, one of the biggest TV channels in Tunisia. And indirectly, many people controlled or influenced media through advertising revenue. So media, to some extent, became mouthpieces for quarreling elites. So on the one hand, we have pluralism and even democracy, right? On the other hand, we have hidden political processes and widespread manipulation of the media and shadowy ownership structures and lots of uncertainty among the public. And this led us to the question that gradually grew as we did our project. What is the political role of journalism in societies where pluralism and widespread media manipulation coexist? That's the main question that we try to answer in this book. It's an important and it's a fascinating question with increasing ramifications globally, because there are more and more societies where pluralism and widespread media manipulation coexist these days. Now, what we did to try and answer that question was basically two approaches. The first one was to interview lots of people, about 100 interviews with journalists and some politicians and civil society people and bureaucrats. So we did interviews in Tunisia and Lebanon, more or less 50-50. But as Kjetil says, we're concentrating on Tunisia today. And then we also analyzed media discourse around some important events in both Tunisia and Lebanon over the course of these years. There was the terrible terror attacks in Tunisia that happened in 2015 at Bardo and Sousse. There were elections in both countries, both presidential and parliamentary elections in Tunisia and parliamentary elections in Lebanon. And also huge protests broke out in Lebanon in 2019. So there was a lot of material that we could draw on. We could draw on the discourse around this to see what sense journalists made of them. Yes, Kjetil, please.
So, media instrumentalization is our kind of the theoretical concept we relate to, and the literature we relate to, and we try to situate these cases in the Arab world to speak to a broader audience. And we noticed that, as Jacob said, media instrumentalization occurs across political and cultural contexts. I mean, in the West, there's more growing concern about polarization, disinformation, but in transitioning democracies, the danger of media instrumentalization is particularly acute. Now, the literature, particularly in media and communication studies, is keenly interested in how businessmen and politicians use the media for their different agendas, and they describe it. But we noticed as we looked at this that there's not as much written on how media professionals and especially journalists relate to this media instrumentalization, because there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. So how do journalists act in situations of pervasive media instrumentalization, what do they do to carve out a space, some measure of autonomy, place where they can do their profession the way they would like to do that. And in order to explain that, one of the things we do is to distinguish between horizontal and vertical conflicts, because we argue that journalists operate in a field that is defined by horizontal and vertical conflicts. Very often, and the literature will explain this, journalists are used to engage in these kind of horizontal conflicts where they're asked to attack the other camp on behalf of some elite who use them to, dig up some dirt on this person or criticize this one. And then the elite on the other side will do the same thing with his journalists and have them kick back. And is often described as journalists being attack dogs on behalf of elites. But we argue that in these contexts of hybrid politics, there is also a vertical conflict in play, because a lot of people are disgruntled about the wheeling and dealing and different strategies of the elites, and are frustrated by the lack of services and wealth they bring to the population. So we try to show that journalists, at times, and we discuss how and when and why, try to connect with this vertical conflict in order to increase their relative leeway or professional autonomy. So to illustrate this with a slide from Lebanon, which I think this is the only slide we have from Lebanon today. But Lebanon is a very clear example where you have these different media aligned to politicians along the horizontal axis of a identity conflict in Lebanon. But you have people also who are so fed up with this sectarian system. And sometimes journalists step out of the regular role of engaging in horizontal conflict and piggyback on the kind of popular disgruntlement that exists. Now, in Tunisia, this is also present. And we should keep in mind that in 2011, as Jacob said, Tunisia came out of a long dictatorship. And journalists had to reinvent themselves in a condition and situation where they would have all of a sudden freedom of expression. There was one of the main gains of the revolution in 2011 in Tunisia, everyone agrees, was freedom of expression. So this freedom of expression, meaning journalists can write and say what they want, at least in principle. And how are they going to use this new freedom? Is one of the things we have tried to study empirically. And of course, the journalists who had been there during Ben Ali didn't disappear. They didn't lose their jobs. They weren't thrown out of the sector, even though sometimes they had very close relations with the previous dictator. They stayed on and tried to adapt. But you also had a new generation of journalists coming in, often with ideas that they wanted to change the way media and journalism was practiced in Tunisia. And this occurred in a context where different elites in Tunisia also were using different media channels in order to promote their own distinct interests. And one of the big problems, I think, of the Tunisian transition has been this kind of quarrels among the elites, which also in Tunisia, like in Lebanon, has left many people tired and disillusioned by these politicians. And by association, sometimes these journalists, at least to the extent that they are affiliated with the politicians. But you can say that there has at least been two phases of the new Tunisian journalism coming out of this. And some of it has been clearly instrumentalized. And I think where part of Tunisian journalism where it's easiest to find instrumentalized journalists is in a phenomenon that is known as les chroniqueurs, the commentators, who appear on radio, especially TV, private, but also to some extent public TV, and comment on all kinds of issues all the time. And they're not very many, but they circulate and comment in different channels, and they're everywhere. And importantly, these chroniqueurs very often have close ties with political or business interests because they have a lot of influence. They're on prime time, all the channels, and one can think they have a measure of influence over the public mood. They often have like a theater role. They will turn up the heat in the talk show and make, this is outrageous, and they will go on, and the temperature will really rise. But often to promote certain political agendas. But then, on the other side of the coin, you also had, of course, journalists who were primarily concerned about exercising their profession and gaining a measure of independence, autonomy for journalism in the country, eager to continue the project that was started in 2011, deepening Tunisian democracy, and who thought that the journalism could actually play a positive role in this project. And they were, you can find them many places, but they were better placed in radio stations than in TV, because TV, for different reasons, were more dominated by this kind of actors, whereas in radio you would have more of this, and especially like in digital news sites, often referred to as alternative media. Now, as Jacob said, we looked at how these different actors, what kind of role they played, how they intervened in acute political conflicts throughout the 5 years that we have looked at, from 2015 to 2020. And one of the issues, or crises we looked at, was the terror attack at the Bardo Museum in 2015, which brought to light the delicate balance between security and rights in Tunisia. How should we strike the balance between protecting the country and preserving the kind of liberal values of the constitution and the revolution? So we did a media content analysis of how prominent commentators, chroniqueurs, on a private TV station, actually the most viewed private TV station, Al Hawar Tunsi, positioned themselves in this debate, and especially how they related to an initiative coming from the Tunisian president at the time, Beji Qais el-Sebsi, who launched an initiative for national reconciliation, was what he called it, which basically granted amnesty to civil servants who were accused of corruption during Ben Ali's time, and overturned the sentences of others, and introduced a new counter-terrorism law, which, among other, allowed the authorities to detain people for 15 days without a charge. So critics, of course, would say that this was putting the democratic transition in reverse. But several of the commentators we studied had a very different discourse and a very different opinion. They were promoting the narrative that Tunisia was facing an existential Islamist threat and therefore needed a strong leader. I'll leave the details of that, but long story short, Tunisian journalists and civil society would later pay the price for that development. Jacob?
So these chroniqueurs and some other editors and journalists, that's one part of this picture of Tunisia at that time. But then the other part is what we have called change agents in our book, and the regulators. So the change agents are journalists who see it as their task to challenge the system and contribute to democratization. And they weren't silent either during the Bardo debate or later. In Tunisia specifically, two kinds of journalistic actors have been very combative and defending free speech and challenging corruption and the lack of transparency in the post-revolution period. First is the National Syndicate of Tunisian Journalists, the SNJT. They have managed to become a strong voice for a large part of Tunisia's journalists. And throughout the last 12 years, they have repeatedly demonstrated against threats to free speech from various quarters and also against harassment of journalists. They've become a strong institutional voice. And then the other highly visible change agent is the network of independent electronic media that sprang out of the blogosphere that existed before Ben Ali's fall. So many of these bloggers that were, they were illegal at the time of Ben Ali, and then afterwards they came out and many of them became journalists and they started news outlets that were then legal. They morphed into professional media outlets like Nawat, like Intifada, more recently Al-Katiba, that you can see there. They publish in Arabic and French and in English, critical investigative journalism. In 2016, Intifada published reports about those parts of the Panama Papers, if you remember those, the leak. Those parts of the Panama Papers that related to Tunisia, and they showed that several of the Tunisian elites were involved in large-scale tax evasion. And as a result, they were viciously attacked in other media, sometimes by these chroniqueurs that Kjetil talked about. But this was also very much part of the picture. SNJT with their demonstrations. I haven't mentioned yet HICA, which is also an important regulator, state regulator, an independent state regulator for the audiovisual media that also played an important role in securing fair and free coverage of political news. So, a very two-sided picture, right? And what we have explained thus far in this little presentation was the situation until 2019. And now we come to what's been happening more recently, since we stopped gathering the data for this book, because that's more or less the cutoff point for our data or 2020. Now, in 2019, there are presidential elections in Tunisia. And the candidates, as well as the outcome, is surprising. The two main top contenders were both populists, but they were very different populists. One was the charismatic media owner, one of the foremost examples of media instrumentalization. This guy here, Nabil Karoui. Flamboyant, charismatic media and businessman. Now the other one was Qais Said. He was described by many as completely uncharismatic, a university lecturer in law who avoided the media altogether. So while Nabil Karoui was a media owner and used his own TV channel for everything it was worth in supporting his own candidature, Qais Said just didn't want to relate to the media. Instead, his grassroots campaign went from door to door and they had meetings in town squares and so on. So Qais Said doesn't like the media. The media doesn't like Qais Said. They ridicule him, and they gave him a popular nickname, Robocop, because they thought he spoke and acted in a very mechanical way. So he was really ridiculed by the media. But he won. He won the elections quite comfortably. And since he won, it's fair to say that the political process in Tunisia has taken a turn for the worse. In terms of governance, Qais Said is very much, as he states, for a direct form of democracy. So he wants a weak parliament. He is not too fond of parties or blocs in parliament. He wants independent, so individual parliamentarians. And he wants a strong presidency. And in 2021, he made what many considered to be a power grab in July of 2021. He froze parliament. He dismissed parliament and the prime minister, and he announced that he would now temporarily rule by decree. All those are not very good signs. He also rescinded parliamentary immunity. And he has ruled like this since that day. Now, just some days ago, a new parliament opened for the first time since this closure in 2021. A new, quite tame parliament opened on the 13th of March. And it was symptomatic that no other journalists than those who belong to the public media channel, El Wataniya, were allowed into the building. So no independent news outlets were allowed into the parliamentary building for the opening. So in terms of the media policy, what we see under Qais Said is a marginalization of independent news media. He prefers to communicate directly via statements on public media or Facebook. And in 2022, he passed a law against fake news and rumors with up to 5 years in jail and hefty fines for publishing what is considered to be fake news or rumors. So the situation we have now is that people are arrested and questioned for publishing critical blog posts, or they're arrested because they're charged with creating fear among the public. So these laws are interpreted quite widely. And political journalism is actively discouraged, with the result that many of the private TV channels no longer air political content. It's just talk shows without political content. And by journalists we spoke to while in Tunisia recently, Qais Said is widely seen as threatening the one remaining gain many think they have after revolution, which is free speech and a free critical media.
So how have Tunisian media reacted to this? There are three, broadly speaking, responses. The first is from the public TV and radio, Al Wataniya, you see on the right, left here. According to journalists we met in Tunisia last week, it has pretty much become a propaganda outlet for the president, especially TV, which has become one-directional and lost all its critical impulse. Then in the middle you have the private TV. This is El Hiwar Tunisi, the biggest, at least used to be, TV channel. The owner is Sami Al-Fahri. And interestingly, in 2019, when Qais Said was running for the election, Hiwar Tunisi was running a vicious campaign against Qais Said. They were really against him. And they did everything they could to discredit him in the election. Now, they failed. They were not in tune with what the people wanted. And afterwards, they have just been radio silenced. So that's the, I'd call it, survival strategy of at least most private TV channels, is just to, it's all about entertainment. We don't go into politics anymore. There's only one private TV channel, Channel 9, that has a political debate program still. But then down on the right is Noureddin Boutar, who was a journalist and also the head director of Tunisia's most important radio station, Mosaic FM, who has really put up resistance. And radio, once again, has continued to be more active. And there's still criticism, a lot of criticism in Tunisian radio. So there's not a fear has not yet installed itself to the degree of erasing criticism in the media. No, there's vivid political debate in Tunisian radio still. And some are, like Mosaic FM, has gone so far that they have become the target of repression. So Noureddin Boutar was arrested without any charge, and then accused of economic fraud. But everyone knew it was about the content of its critical journalism. And when I met a journalist from Mosaic FM last week, they said, well, now, when I go home from work, I take the SIM card out of my phone and I go hiding because I don't want them to come take me in the evening. So they were really living a situation of fear. But fear and defiance. So some of the radios, but also, of course, the digital websites that Jacob mentioned continue to resist this trend. And not least, the Tunisian Journalists Syndicate, which is not at all intimidated and has taken a very combative position, leading demonstrations and calling out laws that have been voted that are detrimental to journalists' rights. And we also visited the SNJT last week, and they said, you know, we know this place is wiretapped, but we're going to say this anyway. So clear defiance, and we have to. This is where we have to draw a line. We cannot let this pass, because if we let this pass, everything is going to fumble. So there is a battle going on in Tunisia today, and it also goes into the journalistic field. So to conclude, where does this leave us? Well, we have analyzed Tunisian media and journalism between 2015 and 2020 as a field of mixed influences. Because the hybrid side of Tunisian politics, while the country was experimenting with democracy, played into Tunisian journalism. And it's fair to say that the media bears its part of the blame for why Tunisia's transition to democracy ended with a backlash. And today, large part of the media have bowed before the authoritarian president. Now, this hybridity and this position affects the public view of journalism as well, because many people don't distinguish between media and journalism. But we have argued that it's quite important to do so, and that journalism under media instrumentalization is a topic of its own and has specific dynamics. Because although media instrumentalization undermines journalism's potential to become a counterpower to the authorities, it is also a source of conflict and resistance inside the profession. And I'll end here and leave the word to Katrine, and we'll soon have a conversation and questions from you in the audience. Please, Katrine. From here, I think. Yeah. No.
Okay, I think I have to first master this here. You have already struggled with this. Is this okay now? Yeah. Okay. Good. It feels a bit unstable. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, the short course through the book, which I think is extremely fascinating. And in the few days I had it already, had the privilege to browse through it. I thought it was really a fantastic read. It has lots of rich material, and I think your presentation certainly gave an indication how sort of in-depth these studies of these two countries over a couple of years are. And I think that's really an important contribution to our understanding how these kind of hybrid political environments and journalism interact. Yeah. I also think that the book has a couple of unique what is it called, unique selling points, unique features which I think stand out in comparison to quite a lot of similar books. One is that most of the studies we have at the moment on journalism are actually survey-based, which are great because they can capture a broad range of comparisons. But usually you don't really know what is the thinking behind the answers. This is the old dilemma with large N and small n research. And I think your book really looks into the thinking of journalists and therefore explains to us what the surveys are actually telling us or not telling us. So I think that is really an important contribution which I really enjoyed reading. And the other thing I really like with this book is that it is written, it sounds a bit odd, by outsiders, meaning by people who are not media scholars and who are not journalists, and often these two come together. Having a media and communication background myself, but coming from politics. So I think there's kind of looking at it from the outside as a political scientist, and an area as a study person, really gives you the freedom and the attachment to look at things without a kind of normative framework. And you mentioned it yourself, because media and communication scholars often are very much attached to normative questions, and I don't put myself outside this. I can't resist normative questions. So, but you often find sentences in books which are going, media hold political power to account. They should, but do they? And this is often, I think, the pitfall of media and communication scholars, to mix up these normative and empirical statements. And what you are doing is really asking, how does journalism work in real life? Yeah, and I think this is really great. Looking at this book, maybe 2 minutes, because this you often refer to democratization, and which is one of my big interests actually as a researcher, it certainly struck me sort of the journey we have taken over the last decades in understanding and explaining democratization. And in the beginning, sort of in the early 1990s, I think scholars believed that you can craft democracy. So you just set up the right institutions, and whether this is elections, parliaments, or you introduce press freedom, you change the regulation of state television into a public service television, and if you follow the instructions, you get the right thing. Okay, that didn't really work, as we now know, but I think this idea of crafting democracy, of course, was driving the democracy support movement, the global democracy support institutions also. So what follows then in the early 2000s, I think, is something like a rude awakening, because what you saw is that the new democracies didn't really look good. And what was even worse was that some of the key institutions of democracy turned out to have unintended consequences, and you could even say catastrophic consequences. And this applies most worrying to elections, for example. Quite a lot of you might know the book by Snyder, From Voting to Violence. So elections turned out not just a motor of democracy, but a motor of war and conflict. So that's really quite worrying. And you could say that a similar observation occurred about the media. So press freedom was a great thing, but nothing has been so much contested like the boundaries of press freedom. And what you got is these big conflicts about security and freedom and how this correlates. But also, instead of this chorus of many voices, a lot of hate speech. okay, we have also this problem. I think we know what is going on. And to my knowledge, I think there's no country really where the transformation of state broadcasting into public service broadcasting was successful. It's really very much how you describe it. Pluralism is another principle which turned out as a double-edged sword. And especially in divided societies, the opening of the media markets exacerbated the divisions. And I think you could fairly say that in all the violent intercommunal conflicts, from Rwanda to Kenya, to the Western Balkans, to Iraq, you name it, the media have played a key role in fueling these conflicts. So this is sort of the dark side of pluralism, and I think especially the Lebanese case is an interesting case to look at about this. So I think what your book is doing is really pointing at these ambivalence, and I think that's really very important, and shedding light on what is going on. And what you mentioned in the end is maybe the third step, is what we are looking at now is not so much democratization anymore, but the titles of recent books are de-democratization. So we see this backsliding here. And again, the question appears, what is the role in these processes of de-democratization and backsliding? But I thought we engage a bit more into question and answers, which gives you a bit more the opportunity to talk about your research and what you found out and whatever. It looks like we are sitting there. Okay. Okay. Oh, this was close. I have one here. Thank you. Oops. Okay. So, I was just picking up on one of the concepts I think Kjetil brought in is journalists as agents of change. As far as I remember, but maybe I remember it not correctly, this is how journalists see themselves, sort of this is a label they gave themselves, sort of at least some journalists who have the ambition to be part of the change. So I was wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit more about the role of journalism in these recent changes towards democracy or back to authoritarianism. And since you have mentioned it already, maybe I can just throw in a study by a US-American scholar, Dan Hallen, which I think is quite interesting to highlight sort of the problem behind this idea. He did a study on the end of the Vietnam War. And one of the myths of American journalism is that the media ended the Vietnam War. At least they were at the forefront of ending the Vietnam War because they mobilized against it. What Dan Hallen actually is showing is that this wasn't really the case, at least not in this kind of straightforward thing. So what you had at this situation was that a lot of protest movement had already developed across the US against the Vietnam War. But in the media so far, they had only a fringe voice. And quite a lot of political elites also thought this is not really going well here and we should get out. So there was a growing sort of resistance against the war. And this was the moment when the media jumped on it. And then, of course, gave it a very loud voice. So what I'm saying is, okay, there might be, again, a bit of a myth about change, and what we need to understand is the conditions under which journalists could be agents of change or not. Sort of this is a bit, maybe fewer cases could support it, or maybe say it works in a very different way.
Yeah, I can start. I think it's a good question, and it's an important point, which I think, often, at least in Western countries, Norway, when you hear about journalism outside of Europe, you mostly hear about journalism being oppressed,
Yes.
right? That's what you hear. You hear because it comes on the agenda when a regime becomes authoritarian and it represses it, it strikes down on journalism, which leaves the impression that journalism is all about democracy. And one of the things we try to show in this book is more complicated than that. Struggles for democracy are part of the picture, but there's a lot more going on that is also analytically important, and which we try to make sense of. So this is why we highlight the fact that the hybridity of the political context goes into the journalistic field as well. So what you find in politics, you re-find in journalism, and that you have journalisms that point in different directions at the same time, and leading us, among others, to conclude that rather than being always a force for democracy, you can see it as a break in both directions. Because when, as we showed glimpses of, at times you had the sense that journalism was a break on transition to democracy in Tunisia. But also today, when Kais Saied is taking the country in an authoritarian direction, journalism is still a break on that drive towards a more authoritarian system. And regarding what influences whether journalism takes that role, there are different factors. I think one of them, and the one we highlight in the book, is the ability to connect and draw on the support of broader publics.
Yeah.
So, which is why we have a whole chapter on the 2019 protests, or revolution, some say, in Lebanon, because that was a moment where this vertical conflict came to its peak, and where a lot of journalists completely dropped the horizontal conflict and said, we're all with the people against this corrupt elite. And they had the people behind them, and that made them stronger.
Yep.
Whereas a big problem in Tunisia today is that the Tunisian public is disillusioned, is disappointed, is tired, has lost faith in politics, and don't seem willing so far to go march for journalists. So there seemed to be a lack, perhaps, of this ability to connect with this vertical conflict in present-day Tunisia, which
was actually one of the explanations why the uprising in Tunisia was so successful in the first place, because of the alliance between people and journalists. Yeah, I think that's really an important thing, not to look at the media as sort of isolated factors or isolated warriors like David against Goliath, but that journalists also operate in a field of power. And if you think they are rational actors, and if they take risks, they probably look out, and obviously look out for alliances, and try to optimize their support, either in the elites or in the general public.
Yeah, and that point came out really, even more clearly in Lebanon than Tunisia, the interviews we did there, where in Lebanon the journalists they had a long experience in relating to a difficult situation that they needed to navigate, much longer than the Tunisian ones. And they were also clearer. Some of them would say, you know, I'm completely against the establishment, and that's the way I work. And others would say, oh, I like the politicians and the businessmen, and they like me. So it's a working relationship. Yeah?
Yes.
And they wouldn't be coy about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good that somebody is saying it. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. If you look at it, say, from elite theory, then parts of the journalists are part of the elite, like political elite and economic elite, and quite often there's even an overlap, like ownership and political roles, navigating between political roles and journalistic roles. Yeah. So that's quite, I mean, your idea of looking at the vertical and the horizontal dimension, I think it's a good idea to also understand that journalism is not a unified field, that there are certainly elite levels and certainly journalists who are absolutely foot soldiers, badly paid and whatever. Yeah. Okay, shall I just come out with my with another question? Yeah, which is actually related to culture, because there is a strong political science approach in this book. I mean, it comes from the research question. Journalism, a bit more like a sociological subject. And I was wondering whether sort of looking at it from a cultural perspective would also enrich sort of the understanding of what is going on. Are there, we often talk about communication cultures, which might differ from one country to the next, which is also quite important in comparative democratization research. Is there something like, say, an Arab communications culture, which is related about, say, how you express sort of, disapproval in public, public-private? What is the public sphere about? Would you say that there's something specific in the Arab world, and maybe also differing between Lebanon and Tunisia?
So this is such a big question.
Yes.
And it's difficult to know even where to begin, you know. There has been, there is by now quite established literature on journalistic cultures, to begin with that, by various authors. And we haven't related so much to that because it's mainly because it's super difficult to just define a culture.
Yeah.
And then to try and see how it affects political action, very, very difficult. So we haven't really tried to define what is this culture and how it. We have just looked at what the journalists say and what they do. But of course, there are. If you say, you know, what is a culture? It has to do with history. It has to do with responses to that history and so on. So obviously, there is some kind of shared history and viewpoints that people have. But we haven't looked very closely into it. I'm, as an area scholar, I'm also wary. I'm a bit suspicious of the culture word because it has been used specifically in Middle East studies so badly.
Yeah.
And making the Middle East and North Africa and the Arab and Islamic world seem like some kind of exception to, you know, whatever, you know, the West or whatever the rest of the world. While we were really preoccupied in this book in trying to, so we build on two very specific cases, but also try to see how might they relate to places elsewhere. And then I don't think culture is at all irrelevant, but I think it's very difficult to pinpoint specific parts of that culture and then try to relate it to others. It's a trade-off, I guess. If we were to go very, very deeply into these societies, and even then, you know, there are different cultures within one country, again, within different ideological streams and so on. It would have been a different book.
Yeah.
I don't know what you feel about that, Kjetil.
I agree, and I think we've been very intrigued when we found differences in culture within a country, like an example from Lebanon, when you had journalists saying we need these civil society organizations that can defend the rights of free speech and civil liberties and journalism and all of that. And then you have journalists more affiliated with media on the kind of Hezbollah side of the landscape, saying that, we absolutely reject these NGOs which are there to undermine, to promote some kind of Western agenda, and who's, we in the current situation, in the situation we find ourselves of resistance and war, we cannot let ourselves be diverted or fooled by these kind of initiatives.
Yeah.
And they would be professional and journalists, and they would have many thoughts about journalistic professionalism. So you find these differences going on and debates. And I think one of the first findings we made was that the fields in both countries are very divided. Journalism in Lebanon and journalism in Tunisia is not one. Yes. And to a lesser degree than what we had expected, we thought, they would be united by their professional requirements, standards or whatever, but often not.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. I mean, it's not only Hezbollah who is making this argument here, which almost sort of delegitimizes it. Because there's quite a lot of discussion about de-Westernizing sort of media studies and journalism. And you have this flow of journalists who come to journalism training to the West, or the Western NGOs who go into countries and tell people what is good journalism. And there is probably a quite understandable reaction against it. But I agree with you. I see what the point is, but I agree with you that sort of a clear answer, what is an alternative model of journalism and public discourse, is not really emerging, where I would be happy to engage with. Yeah. You certainly have different kinds of journalism which is specific to the history, like, for example, journalism as activism, which any American textbook journalist would absolutely reject. Yeah. But many people coming from, say, independent movement or anti-apartheid movement or whatever, they would say, the word is now my weapon, and they would see themselves as activists and not as neutral and objective journalism. And I think this neutrality is one of the values which is quite often challenged, sometimes for good arguments. Sometimes, of course, it's a pretext for partisanship. But I think since these arguments come up quite often, it's not specifically a kind of culture of a particular area, this kind of essentialist culture, but really something more which is contextual of these countries. Yeah.
Yeah, I think contextual is a good word.
Yeah. I don't know what our time is.
It's very important that we have time for questions from the audience, but I think if you have a question, one more question. And
okay. I can invent a lot of questions. Okay, I think then maybe also something which hasn't been covered so much in your presentation is actually the sort of what your research, whether you found something about the relationship between journalists and their audiences, because journalism is actually something which sort of operates in a triangle between journalists, media, politicians, and the audience. So journalists sort of talk into two directions, audiences and politicians. They depend on both. Yeah? And politicians have more power, but without the audience, the media wouldn't go. So I was wondering whether your journalists had some ideas about what the audience is and their own role vis-à-vis the audience and how this maybe affects their strategies, their actions.
The immediate thing that comes to mind when you ask the question of me, I mean, we didn't focus very much on the audience as such, but this difference between the role journalists have ended up having in Tunisia and Lebanon in a difficult situation like we have in Tunisia now, and we had in Lebanon in 2019, quite different, because as Kjetil said in the presentation, they were able to not just latch onto, but actively contribute to this vertical conflict axis, you know, aligning with the causes of the people, like advocacy journalism. You know, I have a cause against the elites. While in Tunisia, while many journalists have exactly the same feelings and inclinations, they have been effectively, outmaneuvered by populists, be it either this guy Nabil Karoui, who owned a media station and then used it, and then the other one who's just anti-media, Kais Said.
Exactly.
And between them, you know, they have managed to create this kind of not hatred, but you know, people just dismiss journalism. Many people dismiss journalism, and not on journalism, but the very idea of facts and truth, which connects to what we're seeing in many places today. You know, that truth is completely relativized, and people are able to come out and say almost anything these days in Tunisia. Yeah. So that's the difference between the way they manage to relate to their audiences in the two countries.
I can add to that it's a question of reputation also for the journalist. If the politician is seen as corrupt and the journalist is seen as licking his back, then it's not going to reflect positively on the journalist either. So and confronting a politician, criticizing a politician, being tough on politicians can be a source of prestige.
Yeah.
And so you get, this is a bold and brave journalist. And you can get a name. Look, he's actually going after these people. So I think that's a way. It's part of the calculus also for journalists. I mean, you would like to. You may earn some extra money with a politician, but perhaps in the long term, it's better to go for the prestige. So, on a different note, in Tunisia, also we found a divide among journalists, among those who said, you know, we have to educate this public.
Exactly,
Our role, because we come out of a dictatorship, our role is to educate the Tunisian public and get rid of this ignorance that has, you know, built up over the years. And we have to take this role. And we have a mission. We're not like in any country. We have to do this. We have to be a constructive force. And others saying, no. This is not the role of journalism. Our role is to inform. It's the only thing we should do. So we had like organized roundtables with journalists in Tunisia, and this debate came up very strongly. Different views of how we should think of the audience and what our role should be.
Between sort of the populist and the paternalistic somehow, And I think this point about populism is actually quite pertinent, because there you have a real competition to journalism, because it's often seen as part of the established sort of sphere of truth-telling, and the elite, sort of populists obviously can sort of benefit from this suspicion against any elite discourses, which I think, and quite often, I think what we are talking about here, about Tunisia and Lebanon, is also something we are talking about our own countries.
Oh, yes.
Because these are certainly problems which is no longer are these new democracies. They still have to learn. We have to educate them. But these are problems we are fighting with ourselves.
I'd like to open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And I should probably have said this from the outset, but this is being recorded. So this should not prevent you from from asking you a question, but if you present yourself, that would be wonderful. Yes, please.
I'm Amel, the ambassador of Tunisia in Norway. I have two very short comments and a question, if I may. I would first say that finally we have a public debate on Tunisia in Norway, because I was waiting for this interest for years now, but from different angles, focusing on why Tunisia should matter to Norway and discussing our partnership in Security Council and other arenas. Some assessments are quite unfair. Therefore, I would kindly invite the Norwegian audience to check the ranking of Tunisia in the World Press Freedom Index, or simply discover the ongoing, vibrant, and free public debates in Tunisian media using Google Translate. My question for the esteemed panel, and but mainly for Mr. Selvik, could you please formulate some policy recommendations for the Norwegian decision makers on the best way to support Tunisians and Tunisia as an important element of stability in the region? Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is a difficult question, I must say, because I don't think foreign countries, especially Norway, has very much influence over what is going on in Tunisia now. So I think that this is primarily driven by internal dynamics. And we have a president now who is both authoritarian and very skeptical of the role of foreign powers. Very skeptical, and is also fueling rhetoric where he's accusing his political opponents of being allied with foreign powers and conspiracy thinking, which makes it very delicate to come from the outside with, all kinds of. Tunisia has a colonial history. Tunisians don't want to be dictated from the outside. I think you would agree. It's not up to us to decide, Tunisia's course. Nonetheless, I think, given that Norway cannot realistically hope to really change the course of events in Tunisia, I think that Norway should be faithful to its own principles and its beliefs, meaning that it should protest when journalists are being repressed, when sound democratic institutions are being undermined, and that I think, in fact, the international community as a whole has been holding back too much in criticizing this power grab since 2021, perhaps out of hoping that it wouldn't be so bad. So it didn't really react to the negative signs that have been building up. Didn't take a clear position. So I think Norway should take a clear position that, we think it's actually a good idea to maintain freedom of expression, to not to jail one's political opponents. It's not a good idea. It's not the way to run a country. So making these kind of very clear statements, I think Norway should do more of. Nonetheless, I don't think it's a good idea either to actively isolate Tunisia. That's my personal position. I think one can disagree, but I don't think too much positive will come out of that either. I think Tunisia is in a difficult spot right now, and I think some of the support that comes from Norway and other countries can potentially help strengthening counter voices, civil society actors, can potentially be a force in the right direction. And it's in nobody's interest, I think, to see this country collapse economically, which is a likelihood now, which is a danger. Yeah, do we want to add anything, Jacob?
No, not really. No, I agree. And but the last point you mentioned, we should keep in mind that the media and journalism is. So we think it's super important. Otherwise, we wouldn't have written the book. But it's only one dimension of what's happening politically in Tunisia or any other country. And right now, the economy is really, I think, the fundamental issue. That and there's a real threat of a collapse. So but I don't know what. To be honest, I don't know what Norway could do about that. I don't think Norway would be the most important actor in that picture.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Mohammad Asaduzzaman. I am research fellow at University of Oslo. My question is, people who are not educated in most of the countries in developing world, after a certain period, they are against they like the anti-establishment news. It is very common. Or if some journalism is oppressed, then they find out the alternate media or something. So we see that Facebook page or Facebook news is a very important role in media and journalism nowadays. So if you go to the South Asia, where I am from, and in all Asian countries, so mainly people are who does not like or who want real news, they rely on the Facebook or other things. So my question is, do you have shed some light on this media and how journalists are behaving in this way? Because in my experience, I saw that many journalists, when they write something in the paper or newspaper, their views in this type of personal tweet or Facebook media that is somewhat different or modified or sometimes contrary. And some newspapers are rooted in abroad, or some page in Facebook, they express more news and people rely million followers or something and more followers than the mainstream newspaper. And how do you have addressed this media and journalism side in Tunisia or in general in Arab countries? Thank you.
Yeah, or anywhere really. I mean, the latest example is from the UK, Katrin, where Gary Lineker, tweeted about the immigration policies for the UK, being a sports commentator. So he did one thing in his job as sports commentator, and somewhat else on Twitter, and there was a huge row about it. Social media are very important in both Tunisia and Lebanon. In Tunisia, Facebook is very, very important still. In Lebanon, Twitter is also, especially among journalists, Twitter is very important. And we've harvested data from both actually. And there's an interesting contrast we can make off the top of my head. So during the revolution, as the Lebanese call it, in 2019. Lots of journalists, they actually used Facebook as a channel to communicate directly with ordinary Lebanese. They had hundreds of thousands of followers. And some of them would actually resign on Facebook. They'd post, "This is my resignation from this and that official media. I can no longer be affiliated with this media because it's part of the elite." And they would resign there and then. So that's one use of Facebook, right? And not to give two different messages, but just using it to make a clean break with the elite. Now, the more sinister aspect of social media, be it in these countries or anywhere else, is of course disinformation, misinformation, rumors, and so on. And that has been actualized in Tunisia recently, because there was this claim that came out of nowhere, really, that there were something like 700,000 sub-Saharan African immigrants in Tunisia, and it's an impossible number. So the true number is somewhere like 30,000, I think. And it prompted the president to go out on public media and say that the security forces and the border police, they should stop these hordes of Africans coming to Tunisia, because they were trying to take away the Arab and Islamic identity of Tunisia and make it into an African country. And this is very much like what we see in Europe with the Great Replacement theory, that the targets are Muslims coming to take away our Christian heritage and so on. And the worrying thing is that when we talk to journalists and media scholars in Tunisia just last week, they would say that this claim, this wild claim of 700,000 sub-Saharan African immigrants, was so difficult to refute. They would sit around the dinner table and talk with their family members, and people would well, I saw it on Facebook, and they would try to come with facts showing this can't be right, but truth has been relativized, and people can say most anything. So that's the other side of it. So very much a double-edged sword.
I would like to add to that that Facebook and other social media can allow journalists to bypass media that are controlled by elites, right? So you can express yourself on Facebook, but they're not the only ones who can bypass the media. And what we see in Tunisia now is that the president himself is using Facebook to bypass the media. So as Jakob mentioned in the presentation, he's basically boycotting journalists, especially at least private media and journalism. He's not going to relate to it. He's not, doesn't even bother to have a press attaché or a communication advisor. He's not going to deal with them at all. And he's going to talk to the public directly through Facebook. And it's part of his idea of the state, that one should get rid of these intermediary factors like the media, but also political parties, and everything should be like some kind of direct democracy, which of course I think is very hard to realize in practice. And so it ends up being his discourse through the Facebook page, directly addressing the audience as a way just to sideline and marginalize media and journalism altogether.
So do you think that it's good for citizen journalism, something that president is using, because not many countries president use that?
No, I wouldn't call it citizen journalism when the president is using it. Here's a question.
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment. I think that we who work with media and journalism and politics, we have a tendency to overlook a very important part of what journalism and the media deal with, and they deal with entertainment. And entertainment is a very important aspect of what is happening also politically. And my comment is that you've been talking all the time, except for one thing I think you said, that now the media are turning to entertainment. And that is part of the problem, isn't it? That we tend to overlook what are the entertaining factors of the media. And that is also related to social media, which I am very skeptical of actually, because part of their appeal is that they are entertaining. The great German philosopher once in 1935 at an anti-fascist conference said that it is possible that the people want to be lied to and to be cheated. But there's one thing which is true. They don't want to be bored.
And of course, entertainment is not non-political. Yeah? I mean, it's very difficult to get hold of the political in entertainment, but probably politics hasn't stopped by the switch to entertainment. Mm.
Are there any more questions in the audience? Yes, we have a question back here.
So I'm Elma, and I'm the daughter of Kjetil. So I was wondering, because you have been telling us all the problems Tunisia struggle with, and therefore I'm wondering what Tunisia can do to get out of the position they are in now.
Well, thank you. That's a very tough question. So it's a really tough question. So what I said, earlier, that the media is part of it. It's an important part because it's for a society to flourish. It's good to have free speech and free media, but it's only part of it. And arguably more important is that you don't have corruption, and that you have a flourishing, business and industrial life. And in Tunisia, and that you have security. In Tunisia, the corruption has been a big problem, so you need to deal with that. And the president, that's one of his main aims. He wants to end corruption, but he hasn't been successful so far. The other very important thing for Tunisia is tourism, because Tunisia is very dependent on tourism for its economy, and it has a fantastic location for tourism from Europe. But people won't go there if they don't feel that it's safe. And that has also been a problem these last years, although that I think is improving now. So yeah, I don't know if that's much of an answer, but I think it's best I can give.
And I would like to add regarding specifically the media and the public debate. I think one alarming thing in Tunisia right now is that people are using very polarized, very strong language, accusing each other of very bad things, even violent language. And this is, currently this is going in the wrong direction. The country is, you can feel the conflict brewing among people who discuss not least on social media. So one thing Tunisia can and should do is to take things down a little bit and don't add more fire, because this can lead to some kind of explosion. You wouldn't like this to flare up and become a violent conflict in Tunisia. And I think that is one important area where Tunisia today can improve. Perhaps, Catherine, I know you had more questions. If you would like to add one towards the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have covered actually quite a lot. I mean, I think what is really sort of important is to understand the ambivalences here. Yeah? That, I mean, I remember this nice line, but I don't know where it comes from. The media are often not good for democracy, but you can't have democracy without the media. This is, I mean, journalists often react and say, okay, this is journalism bashing, yeah? But, I mean, what you just said, yeah, is completely unlikely, yeah, because sort of in media studies, you talk about media logic and political logic as sort of norms and practices which are specific to a particular profession or field. So part of media logic is actually seeking attention. Attention is basically the currency, and therefore, conflict is one of the bread and butter journalism lives of. Yeah, and when you have conflicts in countries, sort of sectarian conflicts, I think you have to show me the case where the media have calmed this down. Yeah, in the country, usually they have flattened up. And it's not only because of media logic, this is one explanation, but it's also that basically most of the journalists are part of the communal groups. Yeah, they are not neutral outsiders like in Lebanon. Everybody belongs to a communal group, and therefore feels also that giving voice to the people is giving voice to my people. Yeah, so there is a representative element to it, where journalists sort of are torn between who am I representing as a journalist, my people, my group, or the people, the nation. And okay, this again turns quite against them, because authoritarian leaders everywhere use this argument quite often, sort of being for the nation, to silenced journalists, that the national unity is the most important thing, so stop the criticism. So I think there are really very complicated decisions for journalists to make, who they are speaking for. To what extent they are led by professionalism, and media logic is actually the alphabet of journalistic professionalism. Yeah, so giving it up or not. So it's a very difficult situation where journalists have to navigate. And I think in the end, maybe this was something also related to my first question about agents of change, is actually to look at journalists not just as victims, and I think you're also pointing it out in your book, who are victims of manipulation and so on, but also as agents. The agency of journalists, they are making choices, of course, taking risk, and often I would say I wouldn't take the risk, but they make choices in terms of the alliances they take with political elites or with civil society and so on. So behind this are sort of choices of individuals and groups, sometimes of organizations. So to some extent, of course, politicians have more power. So there is the manipulation and instrumentalization, but I think this shouldn't divert our view that journalists are also agents, and they benefit, sometimes they benefit from corrupt elites, and sometimes they benefit from criticizing corruption. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think to end on a positive note, I think for us, focusing on journalism has helped seeing more lights. Because if you only look at how the media is used by owners and the rich and the powerful and the corrupted, then you end up thinking, oh, there's no way to go. Yeah. But when you look at individuals and journalists, you see that, oh, so, you know, there's still room for agency here.
Yes.
People still make different choices based on different, you know, could be their beliefs, their convictions. So it gives more hope, ground for optimism, actually, than what you find elsewhere. But I would like to just, first of all, thank all of you who have been here, and just tell you that, unfortunately, this book is not for sale here today, because we have received so few copies from the editor that you cannot buy it from us. But you can have a look at it, either this copy or the copy outside. And there's a brochure. You can order the book from the publisher, which is Edinburgh University Press, and get a 30% discount using the paper, which you will find outside in the reception. Yes. So, but thank you once again, and hope to see you here again on another event.